Welcome to Sleepy Whisper. Please set your volume to a gentle level, close your eyes, and lie still in comfort. Together, we will slowly drift into sleep. This is the very first story in our Boring History for Sleep series. A day at a Chinese scholar's desk in the Song Dynasty. If you enjoy these quiet moments, please like and subscribe so we can meet again in the nights to come. In the quiet light of early morning, the scholar's study was already awake before the man himself had risen. The lattice windows, framed in dark polished wood, allowed a pale beam of dawn to spill gently across the room, catching the dust motes that floated lazily in the still air. Outside, the courtyard was silent except for the faint cooing of doves and the distant splash of water from a servant filling the basin for the day's washing. Inside, the air carried a faint scent of ink, old paper, and dried bamboo. Upon the long, low table at the center of the study lay the tools of his craft, a rectangular inkstone, its surface darkened from years of careful grinding, brushes of varying thickness, their bristles neatly tied and hanging from a carved stand, sheets of pale Juan paper stacked with deliberate precision, and a porcelain brush washer half filled with clear water reflecting the muted light. Alongside these rested a small bronze paperweight in the form of a sleeping tiger, its back curved as if it too were resting in the calm. The scholar's desk was more than a place to write. It was the heart of his intellectual life, a space where the mind could move slowly, without haste, in the rhythms of reading, copying, and reflecting. The Song Dynasty prized scholarship and refinement, and so each object here had been chosen not merely for function, but for the quiet pleasure it could bring. His chair, with its curved wooden back, had been polished by decades of use, its surface warm and smooth beneath the hand. On the shelves behind the desk stood rows of carefully bound volumes, their spines marked in neat brush calligraphy, each containing poems, essays, or historical records copied over generations. The bindings were of plain hemp or silk, worn soft from handling, and the pages held the faint aroma of the mulberry fibers from which they had been made. It was said that a true scholar in the Song era began his day not with hurried speech or practical tasks, but with a slow settling of the mind, as one might let tea leaves unfurl in still water before drinking. Even the act of preparing to write was deliberate, lifting the brush, adding water to the inkstone, moving the inkstick in a slow, circular motion until the deep black fluid emerged, thick and smooth. This morning, as the scholar entered, his robe rustled softly, the long sleeves swaying with each measured step. He paused by the window for a moment, gazing at the courtyard where a single plum tree stood in early bloom, its petals faint against the cool air. He would not rush to sit. Instead, he lingered, listening to the almost inaudible creak of the wooden beams overhead, feeling the faint warmth as the sun began to reach across the floorboards. In the Song Dynasty, the role of the scholar was intertwined with both duty and beauty. His mornings were for study, his afternoons for correspondence or teaching, his evenings for poetry or painting. Yet the core of it all began here, in these early hours, with the mind open to thought and the hand steady for writing. On the table, a small cup of tea steamed faintly, the fragrance of leaves from the mountains curling upward. He lifted it, feeling the gentle heat through the porcelain, and took a slow sip, letting the flavor settle before setting it down without sound. Around him, nothing stirred except the faint rustle of paper as he unrolled a scroll. The characters upon it were bold and elegant, each stroke a testament to the discipline and patience his craft demanded. The day had only begun, but in this room, time felt stretched, as if the outside world had no urgency here. Soon, the brush would touch paper, and the first lines of the day would be born, flowing from the scholar's hand in quiet harmony with the tools that had been waiting for him since the first light of dawn. The ink was ready now, a deep glossy black resting in the well of the stone, waiting to be drawn up by the tip of the brush. The scholar lifted the brush with a gentle turn of the wrist, the bristles coming to a fine point almost by their own accord, shaped by years of familiarity with his touch. His other hand smoothed the Juan paper, feeling its delicate fibers, almost translucent yet strong enough to hold the flowing strokes of his calligraphy. The first movement of the brush was slow, a light touch that left a thin line of ink, followed by a firm, downward stroke, creating the opening character of the day's work. He was copying a classical essay, one he had read countless times before, yet each act of transcription was like walking a familiar path in a forest, where the light and air could still surprise him in subtle ways. The Song dynasty valued this repetition, not as a dull chore, but as a discipline that trained the mind to notice the smallest changes in form, balance, and flow. Outside, the faint sound of a broom brushing the courtyard stones drifted in, steady and unhurried, blending with the occasional call of a bird. Within the room, the only sound was the faint whisper of the brush against the paper, a rhythm that seemed to slow the pulse and quiet the mind. From time to time, he would pause to rinse the brush in the porcelain washer, watching the water cloud with the diluted ink before wiping the bristles clean against the side. The paperweight in the shape of a sleeping tiger kept the scroll from curling, its bronze surface warm from the sunbeam that had now reached the edge of the desk. As he worked, the scholar's breathing matched the pace of his writing, a slow inhale as the brush lifted, a gentle exhale as it settled again on the paper. His brushstrokes were neither hurried nor hesitant. They carried the quiet confidence of a man who had long accepted that mastery was found not in speed, but in the steady refinement of one's art over a lifetime. On a side table, another cup of tea sat cooling, untouched since he had poured it, the faint aroma still drifting through the air. Occasionally, his eyes would lift from the page to rest on the plum blossoms outside, as if to remind himself that beauty was not only in the written word, but in the world beyond the desk. Yet the desk itself was a world, bounded by the familiar tools, the steady light, and the endless possibilities of ink on paper. Today's task was not for an audience. The finished scroll would join others on the shelf, perhaps to be read by a student in years to come, or perhaps to rest quietly, its meaning locked in time. The song scholar understood that much of a life's work might never be seen beyond one's own study, and yet the work was no less worthy for that. It was the doing, the act of shaping thought into form, that mattered. The hours passed without the need for a clock, measured instead by the gradual shift of sunlight across the desk, the slow cooling of the tea, and the soft fatigue in his hand that told him he had written enough for the morning. He set the brush back on its stand, adjusted the scroll so the ink could dry without smudging, and sat back, letting his eyes rest. The faint creak of the chair and the quiet hum of the world outside seemed to fold into one another. In that moment, the study felt like a small, self-contained universe where every detail, from the worn grain of the wood beneath his palm to the distant rustle of leaves, was in its rightful place, and the day's first work had found its quiet completion. As the morning's work came to a close, the scholar rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as though each step were part of a practiced ritual. He walked toward the window, sliding it open to let in a soft current of air carrying the mingled scents of plum blossoms and distant cooking fires. The courtyard below was now bathed in warm light, the shadows of the latticework stretching long and thin across the flagstones. A servant passed quietly with a bamboo tray, pausing just long enough to set down a small plate of steamed dumplings, a cup of fresh tea, and a dish of pickled vegetables. These were not lavish offerings, for the scholar's life was one of simplicity. The Song dynasty's ideal of cultivated living was not measured by excess, but by refinement in small things. He sat once more, this time not at the writing desk, but at a lower table by the window, where he could take his meal while gazing at the stillness of the garden. Each bite was taken slowly, the taste of the dumplings' delicate filling, pork mixed with finely chopped spring onions, lingering before being followed by a sip of tea. Beyond the courtyard wall, the faint clatter of a distant market could be heard, softened by distance until it seemed more like a memory than a present noise. This midday pause was not a break from work, so much as a continuation of the same steady rhythm of the day. In the song scholar's world, even eating was a form of cultivation, the way one held the chopsticks, the way one poured tea, the way one remained present to the moment, all reflected the discipline of the mind. Once the meal was finished, he placed the empty cup aside and leaned back slightly, watching a lone butterfly drift lazily among the branches of the plum tree. The air had grown warmer, and the study seemed to breathe with him, the faint creak of wood in the sunlight, the occasional flutter of paper as a passing breeze stirred it. He returned to the desk, not to write, but to read. From the shelf he selected a scroll of poetry by Su Shi, one of the great figures of the dynasty, whose verses blended the natural world with reflections on the impermanence of life. Unrolling it carefully, he let his eyes move over the characters, each one formed by a hand long gone, yet still alive in its brushstrokes. As he read, his mind wandered through the images painted by the words: moonlight on a river, the cry of a crane, the scent of pine in the rain. Time in the study passed like water flowing under ice, slow yet steady, unmeasured by urgency. Occasionally he would pause, looking up from the scroll to rest his gaze on the shifting patterns of light on the floor, allowing the words to settle before continuing. This midday reading was not for practical learning. It was for the nourishment of the spirit, a reminder that the scholar's desk was as much a place for quiet contemplation as it was for the work of the brush. Outside, the sun had begun its gradual descent, the light softening into a warmer hue. A faint breeze stirred the hanging bamboo wind chimes, producing a hollow, resonant tone that seemed to blend perfectly with the silence. It was a moment without expectation, without haste, one of those intervals in life when the mind and the world seem to breathe in unison. Soon he would return to writing, perhaps to compose a letter or to make annotations in a manuscript. But for now, he simply sat in the golden light, the scroll open before him, the cup of tea cooling at his side, content to let the quiet stretch on a little longer. The afternoon light slanted gently through the lattice windows, casting a pattern of shifting diamonds across the scholar's desk as he prepared for the next stretch of work. The meal had left him neither drowsy nor restless, only settled into a deeper stillness that seemed to match the slower pace of the day. He cleared the desk with quiet care, stacking the morning scrolls neatly to one side, their ink now dry and faintly glossy. A clean sheet of Juan paper was unrolled, held flat by the weight of the bronze tiger once more. This time, his work would not be a copy of an existing text, but a letter to a friend, a fellow scholar living in a distant province, with whom he exchanged thoughts on literature, politics, and the small details of daily life. The letter would begin with the customary courtesies, words chosen as much for their elegance as for their meaning, before moving into the gentle rhythm of shared reflections. He took up the brush again, its bristles freshly rinsed, and dipped it lightly into the ink, watching the liquid climb toward the tip before touching it to the paper. Each character emerged slowly, as if drawn out by the quiet of the room itself. Between sentences, he would pause, lifting his gaze to the garden beyond the window, where the shadows of the plum branches swayed slightly in the breeze. A bee moved from blossom to blossom, its faint hum almost lost in the stillness. Writing a letter in this age was as much an act of art as it was of communication. The shape of the characters, the spacing of the lines, and the choice of phrasing all carried weight. The recipient would not only read the words but see the care in their formation, feel the pace of thought in the flow of the brush. Once the main body of the letter was complete, he let the ink dry naturally while reaching for a small box of seals. Inside, carved stones of varying shapes held impressions of his name, his studio, and a few short phrases that carried personal meaning. He selected one and pressed it into a dish of red cinnabar paste, the scent of the mineral rising faintly. With a steady hand, he placed the seal at the end of the letter, leaving a square mark in rich vermilion against the pale paper. Setting the finished letter aside, he turned next to a smaller project, making notes in the margins of a historical manuscript. The Song dynasty valued annotation as a dialogue across time. His small characters, written between the lines or in the edges of the page, would one day guide another reader, offering insight or questioning an argument. This work was slower still, the kind of task where minutes could pass unnoticed as his attention narrowed to the delicate balance of thought and ink. Outside, the light continued its gradual shift toward evening, and the air took on the faint coolness that marked the approach of night. From somewhere beyond the garden wall came the distant sound of a lute being played, its soft plucked notes weaving in and out of the quiet like threads of gold in a muted tapestry. The scholar paused, listening before returning to his work, the music fading into the background as naturally as the sound of the wind. When at last he laid the brush down, the desk was once again scattered with papers, each bearing the traces of the afternoon's labor, letters, notes, and the beginnings of a new poem whose first lines had come to him unexpectedly while writing. He would not finish it today. Poems, like the seasons, moved at their own pace. Rising from his chair, he stretched slowly, feeling the weight of the hours in his shoulders, and stepped to the window. The sun was low now, its light burnished and soft, and the shadows in the courtyard had grown long. The day was not yet over, but the work of the desk was nearly done, and the evening would bring a different kind of quiet. As the final light of the day faded, the scholar moved quietly about the study, adjusting the shutters to soften the cool air that drifted in from the courtyard. The scent of evening was different from the morning, less crisp, more settled, carrying traces of earth and wood smoke from the nearby kitchens. He lit the oil lamp on the desk, its small flame flickering before finding a steady glow, casting a warm circle of light that left the edges of the room in gentle shadow. The bronze paperweight, the inkstone, and the brushes each took on a different character in this light, their surfaces catching and reflecting it in muted tones. He set aside the papers from the day, tying some into neat bundles with silk cord and placing them on the lower shelf where the records of past months and years lay in quiet order. Evening at the desk was not always for work. Often it was a time for reviewing what had been written, making small corrections, or reading aloud from a favorite text. Tonight, he chose a collection of essays on governance and moral philosophy, the kind of work that required not just the mind, but a certain steadiness of heart to approach. His voice was low and even as he read, the sound barely louder than the scratching of a mouse in the rafters. Between passages, he would pause to sip from a cup of warm tea, the steam rising in a thin ribbon, briefly catching the lamplight before disappearing. Beyond the window, the garden was a dim silhouette, the plum blossoms now only pale shapes against the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, the faint beat of a drum marked the passage of time in the town beyond, reminding him that while his study was a quiet island, the larger world moved steadily onward. After a time, he set the book aside and took up a fresh sheet of paper, not to work, but to let his thoughts drift onto the page in the form of a poem. The lines came slowly, each one considered, written with the same care as his formal work, but without the weight of obligation. The poem was a reflection of the day, its stillness, its small pleasures, the way light and shadow had moved across the desk. When the last character was written, he placed the brush down and leaned back, letting his eyes rest on the lamplight's soft glow. There was a comfort in this ritual, in the slow winding down of both mind and space. The tools on the desk seemed to settle with him, the ink drying, the paper lying quietly under the paperweight, the brush tips softening as they dried. In the Song dynasty, the scholar's life was one of constancy, yet within that constancy lay an infinite variety of moments. The first stroke of the brush in the morning, the changing colors of the sky through the lattice, the scent of tea leaves as they steeped, the feel of paper under the hand. Each was a reminder that life, even in its most ordinary hours, held a depth that could only be seen by those willing to move slowly. With the lamp still burning low, he rose once more to slide open the window, allowing the cool night air to enter. He stood there for a while, listening to the quiet, until the world outside felt as much a part of the study as the desk and the books within it. Then, with a final glance at the room, his small world of ink, paper, and thought, he extinguished the lamp, letting the darkness return, and stepped away into the soft embrace of the evening. Night had fully settled over the courtyard by the time the scholar returned to his study, the earlier lamplight now replaced by the faint silver glow of the moon filtering through the lattice windows. The air was cooler, carrying with it the soft rustle of leaves and the distant trickle of water from the stone basin outside. Entering quietly, as if not to disturb the stillness, he lit a smaller lamp on a side table, letting its gentle light pool in one corner of the room, leaving the rest in comforting shadow. This was the hour he reserved for reflection, not the practical work of writing or copying, but the quieter task of reviewing the day in his mind. He seated himself once more at the desk, though this time his posture was more relaxed. His sleeves pushed back slightly, his hands resting loosely on the wooden surface. In front of him lay the scrolls and papers he had worked on earlier, each one a marker of the day's progress. Slowly he unrolled the letter he had written that afternoon, reading through it line by line, making only the smallest adjustments, a tightened phrase here, a slightly more elegant character there, before rolling it back with care. He then turned to the annotations in the historical manuscript, tracing each note with his fingertip, satisfied with the precision of his earlier thoughts. The act of reviewing was not merely to check for errors, but to allow the day's work to settle into memory. as one might allow tea leaves to rest at the bottom of a cup before the final sip. Occasionally, his gaze drifted to the moonlight on the floor, watching its slow movement as the night deepened. From somewhere far away came the muffled call of a night watchman striking his clapper, a steady rhythm marking the passing of the hours. The scholar reached for a small, unadorned wooden box, opening it to reveal slips of bamboo tied in bundles, each inscribed with brief notes, fragments of thought, or quotations from books he had read over the years. He took one bundle and spread a few slips across the desk, reading them slowly, sometimes nodding to himself at an insight long forgotten, other times quietly setting aside a note to ponder further in the days to come. These fragments were like seeds, not all of which would grow into full works, yet each worth keeping. After some time, he began the quiet task of preparing the desk for the next day. The brushes were rinsed once more, shaped gently to their fine points before being hung on the stand. The inkstone was emptied of its remaining liquid and wiped clean, ready to receive fresh water and ink in the morning. The paper was stacked neatly, with a new sheet placed at the center of the desk, held in place by the sleeping tiger. Even this act of tidying was a form of contemplation, a signal to the mind that the day was complete. When the work was done, he poured himself one final cup of tea, this one lighter, infused with dried chrysanthemum flowers, whose pale petals floated in the warm water. He drank slowly, the faint sweetness lingering on his tongue, while his eyes rested on the shelves lined with books. Each volume represented countless hours like these, quiet, deliberate, unhurried, and together they formed the tapestry of a life devoted to thought and learning. When the cup was empty, he set it down with the same care he gave to all his tools, rose from his chair, and let the lamplight fade once more. The moonlight was enough to guide him out, its silver glow touching the edge of the desk one last time before the room was left to the stillness of the night. The house was silent now. The servants retired to their quarters, the garden still except for the occasional sigh of wind passing through the plum branches. The scholar's bedchamber was not far from the study, a modest room with plain wooden walls, a low bed draped in a neatly folded quilt, and a small table holding a ceramic oil lamp whose flame had been turned low. He entered without hurry, removing his outer robe and folding it over a wooden stand, the simple act accompanied by the soft rustle of cloth in the quiet. Sitting at the edge of the bed, he loosened the ties of his inner garment, letting his shoulders relax after the day's labors. Before lying down, he reached for a narrow-bound journal placed carefully beside the lamp. It was not a ledger of scholarly work, but a personal record, brief notes of weather, small occurrences in the courtyard, a line of poetry that had come to mind during the day, or a thought sparked by something he had read. Turning to a fresh page, he dipped a small brush into the inkwell and wrote with the same steady hand he used for formal texts, though here the characters were smaller, more private. Tonight he noted the way the late afternoon light had touched the plum blossoms, how the breeze had carried the distant notes of a lute, and how the moonlight now fell in a sliver across the desk he had just left behind. Closing the journal, he placed it back in its spot, then leaned forward to extinguish the lamp, plunging the room into the softer, silvery light of the moon. The quilt was cool against his skin as he lay down, stretching his legs and letting the weight of the day sink into the mattress. Outside, the steady drip of water from the basin formed a quiet rhythm, joined now and then by the faint rustle of night creatures in the garden. His breathing slowed, his mind turning not to worries or unfinished tasks, but to the slow sequence of the day just past. The brush in his hand, the steam rising from the tea, the shifting play of light and shadow across the paper. In the Song dynasty, sleep was not seen as an interruption to one's life of study, but as part of the same harmony, a necessary turning of the cycle. The scholar let his thoughts drift with no effort to control them, as one might watch petals float downstream without reaching to catch them. In time, the sounds of the night faded into the deeper quiet of his own rest, and his body settled into stillness. Hours passed without his notice, the moon crossing the sky, shadows shifting on the garden wall. By the time the first light of dawn began to touch the edges of the courtyard once more, the scholar's breathing was slow and deep, his mind readying itself, without rush, for the return of another day at the desk. Soon, the sound of a servant's soft steps would approach, The faint aroma of boiling water for tea would reach the room, and the slow, deliberate rhythm of ink and brush would begin again, as it had countless times before, and as it would for many days yet to come. The first pale threads of dawn crept quietly into the courtyard, touching the tiled roof with a faint silver glow before sliding through the lattice windows of the study. The air was cool and carried the clean scent of morning, tinged with the faint fragrance of plum blossoms that had fallen overnight. A servant moved softly along the stone path, carrying a kettle from which steam rose in gentle spirals, the sound of water shifting inside, marking the quiet pulse of the day's beginning. Inside the bedchamber, the scholar stirred, not with haste, but with the natural ease of someone accustomed to early rising. He sat up slowly, folding back the quilt, his bare feet meeting the smooth, cool surface of the wooden floor. There was no rush, only the familiar comfort of a day unfolding in its own time. After dressing in a fresh robe of pale blue linen, he made his way to the study. The sound of his steps muted against the polished floorboards. The room felt different in the early morning light, emptier, as if it had been holding its breath all night in anticipation of his return. On the desk, the bronze tiger still rested upon the fresh sheet of Schwan paper he had set out the previous night, waiting patiently. He opened the window to let in the soft air, the faint rustle of leaves outside blending with the distant call of a morning bird. The servant entered without a word, placing the steaming kettle on the side table and pouring hot water into a clay teapot, already holding curled leaves from the previous year's harvest. The aroma filled the room quickly, earthy and warm, promising the first sip of the day. As the tea steeped, the scholar began his morning preparations, moving each tool into place with deliberate care, brushes aligned on their stand, inkstones set at the right angle, paper straightened so that its fibers caught the light evenly. He reached for the ink stick, its surface worn smooth from countless mornings like this, and began to grind it against the stone in slow, circular motions. The sound was soft yet distinct, a quiet rasp that seemed to draw the mind into focus. Outside, the light grew stronger, casting gentle patterns on the desk, through the lattice. By the time the ink had reached the perfect shade of deep black, the tea was ready. He poured a small cup, letting the steam curl against his face before taking a slow sip, feeling the warmth spread through him. Setting the cup aside, he picked up the brush, dipping it into the ink with practiced precision, and poised it above the waiting paper. The first character of the day emerged, steady and deliberate, anchoring him in the present moment. Writing in the morning carried a different energy than writing in the afternoon or evening, clearer, lighter, as though the thoughts were fresher, and the hand more eager. He worked without hurry, the world beyond the courtyard still quiet, the only sounds the faint scrape of the brush, the occasional sigh of the wind, and the muted clink of porcelain as he set down his cup between lines. In these moments, the scholar felt the full circle of his life, how each day began and ended at this desk, how the hours flowed together into something that felt both unchanging and ever new. As the sun rose higher, the shadows on the desk shifted, and the first hints of warmth touched the floorboards. Another day had begun, and the cycle of thought, writing, and quiet reflection was once again in motion, as it had been for years, and as it would continue for years to come. As the morning deepened, the light in the study took on a warmer tone, spilling across the desk and catching the fine threads in the paper's texture. The scholar paused for a moment to set his brush down, allowing the ink on the page to dry naturally while he lifted his cup of tea for another slow sip. The fragrance was softer now, the leaves having given most of their flavor to the earlier pours, yet it was still a quiet comfort against the cool air drifting in from the open window. Outside, the sounds of the courtyard began to grow, subtle but present, the faint swish of a broom sweeping the flagstones, the gentle splash of water as a servant tended to the plants, and the distant clatter of a cart passing beyond the garden wall. The scholar reached for another scroll, this one a volume of essays on the cultivation of character, the kind of work that required not only reading, but careful thought between lines. He unrolled it slowly, his eyes moving at a pace that allowed each phrase to settle fully before continuing. Occasionally, he would lift the brush again to make a note in the margin, small, precise characters that would be legible to any future reader, though perhaps only fully understood by one who had sat at this very desk. A slight breeze stirred the hanging chimes outside, their mellow tone lingering in the air long after the movement had stopped. The scholar glanced toward the sound, his gaze settling briefly on the plum tree, where the morning sun now lit each blossom with a faint translucence. He thought, not for the first time, of how these same blossoms would fall in just a few weeks, leaving the branches bare until the next season's return, a quiet reminder of the cycles that guided both nature and study. Turning back to his work, he continued making careful annotations, sometimes pausing to grind a bit more ink, the soft rasp of stone against stick filling the pauses between thoughts. There was no urgency in the task. The value lay not in finishing quickly, but in inhabiting the process fully, each stroke of the brush a moment complete in itself. After some time, he set the scroll aside and reached for a small wooden box containing slips of bamboo inscribed with quotes and proverbs collected over the years. Selecting one at random, he read it silently, letting the words echo in his mind before placing it at the edge of the desk for later reflection. This simple habit, repeated countless times, was as much a part of his scholarly life as the writing itself, offering small sparks of insight that might shape a future letter, essay, or poem. The room was warmer now, the sunlight having reached the far corner, and the faint scent of tea leaves and ink mingled in the still air. Beyond the window, the world was moving in its own steady rhythm, yet here, at the scholar's desk, time seemed to stretch, each moment holding its place without pressing forward. The brush, the ink, the paper, all were as they had been yesterday, and yet each day they met in a slightly different way, shaped by the light, the air, and the thoughts that came to rest upon the page. By late morning, the work of the day had settled into a steady rhythm, the kind that carried its own quiet satisfaction without the need for outward acknowledgement. The scholar finished his latest set of annotations and laid the scroll gently to one side, aligning it perfectly with the others on the desk. He poured the last of the tea into his cup, swirling it slowly before taking a sip, savoring the faint bitterness that lingered from the leaves. Outside, the sun was high enough to cast a more direct light into the room, brightening the grain of the wooden shelves and making the red threads in the binding of certain volumes stand out more vividly. The scholar stood, stretching his arms slightly, then moved to the window to gaze at the garden below. The plum blossoms had begun to drop a little more quickly under the stronger sun, each pale petal drifting in a slow spiral before settling on the stones. He watched them for a time, noting how their scattering seemed random, yet each found its resting place without effort. Turning back to the desk, he began to prepare for the midday meal, not by rushing to leave his work, but by closing each scroll and tying it neatly with silk cord, ensuring the ink on every page was fully dry before storing it away. The brushes were rinsed once more and hung carefully on their stand, the inkstone cleaned and set to dry. On a small side table, he placed the bamboo slip he had selected earlier, a reminder to reflect on its words later in the afternoon when the light would be softer and the pace slower. The faint sound of footsteps approached, one of the household servants bringing the noon meal. A tray was set quietly on the low table near the window, a simple bowl of rice, a dish of greens sautéed with sesame, and a small serving of fish lightly seasoned with ginger. The scholar bowed his head slightly in thanks before taking his seat. He ate without haste, each bite measured, his gaze sometimes drifting to the courtyard, where the shadows had shortened to almost nothing under the midday sun. The meal was not long, but it was unhurried, the kind of pause that refreshed without breaking the continuity of the day's work. When he was done, he poured a final cup of tea and let it cool slightly as he sat in stillness, feeling the quiet of the study gather around him once more. The air was warm now, touched by the scent of sun-warmed wood and faint traces of ink still lingering from the morning. Soon the afternoon would begin, and with it another round of reading, writing, and quiet thought, each moment folding into the next as seamlessly as the characters flowed from his brush. In the life of the song scholar, there was no sharp division between labor and rest, between study and living. They were threads of the same cloth, woven together in the calm, unbroken pattern of days like this one. As the scholar looked once more toward the desk, the tools of his craft waiting patiently in their places, he felt the familiar sense of contentment that came from knowing that tomorrow, and the day after, and many days beyond, would unfold in much the same way, an unending cycle of ink, paper, thought, and the quiet beauty of a life lived in deliberate harmony. That was the end of our previous story. Before we begin the next one, may I kindly ask you for a like and a subscribe. And now, let us continue with the next story in our Boring History for Sleep series. The long trade routes of Timbuktu. In the pale light of early morning, long before the heat of the sun would press down on the sands, the ancient city of Timbuktu lay quiet beneath a sky of soft, muted gold. The outlines of its earthen buildings, shaped from mud brick and smoothed by centuries of wind, stood like silent sentinels against the horizon. Narrow streets wound through the heart of the city, still empty except for the faint shuffle of a lone merchant making his way toward the central market, his sandals whispering against the dust. Outside the city walls, the desert stretched in every direction, its rolling dunes fading into the haze of distance. This was the starting point or the end, depending on one's direction, of some of the most important trade routes of the medieval world. Paths worn smooth not by wheels or hooves in a single season, but by the slow, steady passing of countless caravans over hundreds of years. Even now, in the quiet before the day began, the traces of those routes could be imagined. The rhythmic plod of camels carrying salt from the mines of Tudeni, their shadows long in the morning light, the creak of leather packs heavy with gold dust from the mines far to the south, the faint rustle of parchment scrolls tucked into cases, destined for the city's scholars, the aroma of spices drifting from sacks tied carefully to saddle frames. The city's position was not an accident. Timbuktu was a meeting point where the north's salt met the south's gold, where goods from the Mediterranean mingled with those from sub-Saharan Africa, and where knowledge traveled as surely as any commodity. In the Songhai and Mali empires, the routes leading to and from Timbuktu were arteries of both wealth and culture, lifelines that connected distant lands through the slow, deliberate movement of goods, people, and ideas. The journey across these routes was long and demanding, stretching over hundreds of miles of desert where water was scarce and shelter rarer still. Yet the caravans came, drawn by the promise of trade and the enduring rhythm of the routes that had existed long before any one traveler was born. In the soft dawn, preparations for such a journey could be imagined. Camel handlers checking straps and tightening knots, merchants counting and recounting their wares, guides consulting their memories of the stars and the wind to determine the best time to depart. The desert, for all its vastness, was never truly empty. It held the echoes of those who had passed before, and the promise of those yet to come. As the first rays of sunlight touched the tops of Timbuktu's mosques, their earthen minarets glowing with a warm, golden hue, the city seemed to draw a slow, quiet breath, ready to welcome those arriving from the long roads and to send others forth into the shimmering expanse beyond. Here, at the edge of the Sahara, the trade routes were not merely lines in the sand. They were threads that wove together the histories of kingdoms, merchants, and scholars, binding them into a fabric that stretched far beyond the dunes into lands and stories yet unseen. By the time the sun had risen fully above the horizon, the caravan was ready to depart, its long line of camels stretching like a moving shadow across the open plain beyond the city walls. The handlers, wrapped in flowing indigo robes that shielded them from the sun and wind, moved quietly among the animals, checking loads one last time before the journey began. Each camel carried its burden with a slow, swaying gait, sacks of salt bound in thick leather, bundles of cloth woven from distant looms, jars sealed with wax to protect precious oils, and small chests containing gold dust carefully wrapped in cloth. The air was still cool, but the knowledge of the heat to come lingered in the back of every mind. There was no rushing a journey such as this. The desert allowed for no shortcuts, and its pace was one that had to be respected. Step by steady step, the caravan moved forward, the sound of padded hooves pressing into the sand blending with the faint creak of rope and the muffled jingling of small bronze bells tied to the camels' harnesses. The lead guide walked ahead, staff in hand, eyes scanning the distant horizon where the land seemed to dissolve into shimmering air. He knew the route as well as one might know the corridors of their own home, not because it was marked by signs, but because the memory of its twists and turns had been passed down through generations of desert travelers. The open sky arched endlessly above, pale blue now, but destined to blaze with white heat by midday. As the caravan moved further from Timbuktu, the sounds of the city faded until they were replaced entirely by the quiet rhythm of travel, the occasional call of a handler to his camel, the dry whisper of sand stirred by the wind, the slow breathing of the animals in time with their steps. To travel these routes was to understand both the vastness and the subtlety of the Sahara. Its endless dunes that could shift and reshape themselves overnight. Its hidden wells known only to those who had walked this path before. Its rare patches of scrub or palm where a brief rest could be taken. The caravan would travel for hours before stopping, not at random, but at points chosen for their balance of shelter and resources. These pauses were short, enough to let the camels rest and the traders share water from goatskin bags before the long march resumed. Along the way, other caravans might be met, lines of travelers moving in the opposite direction, their loads carrying the scents of faraway lands, spices from the coast, dates from oasis towns, manuscripts written by scholars in cities across the desert. Greetings were exchanged in passing, news traded in brief, before each group continued on their separate way. In this slow exchange, the trade routes were more than paths for goods. They were channels for the spread of ideas, for the quiet mingling of cultures that would leave their marks in Timbuktu's markets, libraries, and architecture. As the sun climbed higher and the desert began to shimmer in the heat, the caravan pressed on, each step a reminder of the patience and endurance required to cross a landscape as unforgiving as it was beautiful. As the long day drew toward its close, the light over the desert shifted from a harsh, shimmering glare to a softer gold that stretched in long shadows across the sand. The caravan, having traveled for many hours at its steady, unbroken pace, began to slow as the lead guide signaled that the night's encampment was near. There were no visible walls or buildings, yet to the practiced eyes of the travelers, the place was as familiar as any city square. Here, the sand was firmer underfoot, shaped by the wind into low ridges that offered some shelter. And just beyond a shallow rise lay a well known only to those who had crossed these routes for generations. The camels, sensing the day's end, shifted their gait, their heads lowering slightly, the soft jingle of their harness bells becoming slower, more irregular. When the caravan reached the chosen spot, the handlers moved with quiet efficiency, untying the leather straps and lifting the loads from the camels' backs, placing each bundle in a neat row on the sand. The animals knelt in the fading light, folding their legs beneath them with a soft sigh, grateful for rest. A few of the men fetched water from the well, filling leather bags and pouring some into shallow bowls for the camels, whose long necks stretched forward eagerly to drink. Others began preparing the evening meal, flatbread baked over small, low fires, dried meat softened in boiling water, and tea brewed strong and sweet to chase away the day's dryness. The scent of the tea leaves curled upward into the cooling air, mingling with the faint aroma of the wood smoke. Around the small fires, the traders and guides sat in loose circles, their voices low, speaking in a mixture of languages learned along the routes: Arabic, Songhai, Tuareg, and others picked up in markets and oases. They spoke not only of trade, but of weather, distant cities, and the news carried from one caravan to another. The desert night began to deepen, the horizon blurring into a band of purple that gave way to an expanse of dark velvet sky. Stars emerged one by one, then in clusters, until the Milky Way stretched above in a shimmering arc, its light so clear it seemed almost close enough to touch. The air cooled quickly, and the men wrapped their robes more tightly around themselves, the indigo cloth darkening further in the starlight. Beyond the circle of firelight, the camels lay silent, their forms blending into the shadows, only the occasional movement of an ear or the soft huff of breath marking their presence. The desert at night held a stillness unlike any other, no sound but the faint crackle of the fires, the distant sigh of the wind, and the occasional muted murmur of voices. Here, far from the city walls of Timbuktu, the trade routes revealed their other side, not the bustle of markets or the weight of goods exchanged, but the quiet endurance of those who carried them, the long spaces of time filled with patience, memory, and the shared understanding that tomorrow the journey would begin again, step by steady step, across the endless sands. Before the first light of dawn reached the desert, the caravan was already stirring. The fires from the night before had burned down to faint embers, sending out only a whisper of warmth into the cool, dry air. The stars still hung in the sky, though their brilliance had softened, and on the horizon a thin band of pale silver hinted at the coming day. The camel handlers moved quietly, their robes brushing softly against the sand as they gathered the loads and secured them once more to the animals. The camels rose in their slow, deliberate way, stretching their long necks before settling into a patient stance, as if they, too, understood the rhythm of departure. Water from the well was shared one last time before it was sealed again, a gesture of care for the scarce resource that would be left untouched until the next travelers arrived. The lead guide stood apart from the others for a moment, scanning the landscape ahead, reading the subtle curves of the dunes, the faint patterns left by the wind, and the position of the fading stars. These signs, invisible to an untrained eye, told him how the day's path would unfold. When the first hint of warmth touched the air, the caravan began to move, their progress marked by the soft thud of padded hooves and the gentle creak of leather straps under the weight of their loads. The desert in these early hours felt almost kind, the light still low and the heat far away, but the travelers knew that by midday, the sun would press hard against their backs, and the air would shimmer with a dry, wavering heat that made the horizon dance. The guide led them along a route that curved between high dunes, their slopes catching the first blush of dawn and casting long, cool shadows. From time to time, the caravan crossed stretches of flat, open sand where the wind left no clear markings, and here the guide relied on memory alone, trusting the knowledge passed to him by those who had walked these same routes before he was born. The silence was deep but not empty. It carried the faint hiss of shifting grains of sand, the low murmurs of traders speaking softly to one another, and the occasional call to a camel whose attention had wandered. Hours passed in this slow, steady motion, each step measured, each breath paced. When the sun began to rise higher, the heat made itself known, first as a warmth on the shoulders, then as a steady, enveloping presence that seemed to come from every direction at once. The caravan adjusted its pace, conserving energy, the handlers drawing their veils more closely over their faces. In the distance, a small stand of palms marked the location of a known rest stop, an oasis where they could pause in the shade, water the camels, and share a meal before pressing onward. As they approached, the faint glimmer of water appeared between the trees, a rare mirror in the midst of the sand. The arrival was quiet, almost reverent, for in the desert such places were not taken for granted. They dismounted, loosened the camels' loads, and led them to drink while the traders sat in the thin shade, pouring tea from small metal pots and tearing pieces of bread to share. Beyond the ring of palms, the desert stretched on in every direction, its silence as deep as the sky above, reminding them that the road ahead was still long, and the journey's true measure was in the patience with which it was taken. By the time the caravan left the shelter of the oasis, the sun had climbed high into the sky, its heat radiating down with a steady, inescapable weight. The thin shade of the palms soon fell behind, replaced once more by the open expanse of sand that seemed to stretch without end. The camels moved with their same unhurried rhythm, each step pressing softly into the warm surface, their shadows short and dark beneath them. The handlers walked alongside, their indigo veils drawn close across their faces, the fabric darkening with a faint sheen of heat where it touched their skin. The air was filled with the dry, almost metallic scent of sun-baked earth, mingled with the faint aroma of the goods they carried, salt with its sharp tang, leather softened by oil, and a trace of spice from hidden bundles deep within the loads. In the afternoon light, the desert's colors shifted subtly. The golden tones of morning had given way to a brighter, almost white brilliance that made the horizon shimmer. From time to time, a faint mirage appeared in the distance, a wavering pool of blue that vanished as the travelers drew nearer, leaving only more sand and the slow rise and fall of dunes. The guide led them along a narrow valley between ridges, where the wind had carved smooth curves into the walls of sand. Here, the air felt still, and the footsteps of the caravan were muffled, as if the desert were absorbing every sound. The traders spoke little, saving their energy for the long hours ahead, but their eyes moved constantly, watching the landscape for any sign of other travelers, a change in the wind, or the distant shape of a bird that might hint at water or shelter. Occasionally, they passed the weathered remains of old markers, wooden posts long stripped bare by the elements, or small cairns of stone that once guided travelers through the shifting land. These silent sentinels were reminders of the countless journeys that had been made before, of lives spent following the same routes in seasons past. The heat was at its strongest now, the air thick with light, yet the pace did not falter. Camels were well suited to such conditions, their steady movements conserving strength, their broad padded feet spreading their weight over the sand. The men drank sparingly from their water skins, each sip measured, knowing that the wells ahead were still many hours away. As the afternoon wore on, the angle of the sun began to shift, and with it the light softened just enough to hint at the approach of evening. Long shadows returned, stretching out behind the caravan like quiet companions. In the far distance, a faint line of darker land marked the next waypoint, a rocky outcrop known to those who traveled these paths as a place of shelter from the wind. The thought of its shade and the small water source hidden nearby lent a subtle lift to each step. Still, the journey continued at the same measured pace, for in the desert there was no reward in rushing. Every movement was part of the greater rhythm, every hour a thread in the long fabric of the route, carrying the caravan forward across the vast and timeless expanse toward the next resting place. By the time the caravan reached the rocky outcrop, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long bands of shadow across the sand, the air cooling slightly though the warmth of the day still lingered on the stones. The outcrop rose from the desert floor in smooth, rounded shapes, weathered by centuries of wind and sun into a natural fortress that offered protection from the shifting gusts of the open plain. The camels were led to a sheltered hollow where the sand was firm, their loads carefully untied and set down in neat rows, each bundle placed so that its contents would remain undisturbed through the night. The animals knelt with a familiar grace, folding their long legs beneath them and settling into the sand with soft sighs, their shadows stretching out like dark brushstrokes in the fading light. A few of the handlers climbed the lower slopes of the rocks to fetch water from a narrow crevice, where it collected after rare desert rains, the supply modest but enough to fill the leather skins and offer a drink to the weary animals. Others gathered dried brush and small pieces of wood carried for just such stops, arranging them into low fires whose flames flickered gently against the stone. The smell of smoke and tea leaves began to mingle in the cooling air, the soft bubbling of the pots a quiet counterpoint to the deepening silence of the desert. The traders sat in small groups, passing cups from hand to hand, their voices low as they shared fragments of news from the last towns they had visited, or spoke of distant markets yet to be reached. Above them, the sky shifted slowly from the warm gold of sunset to the deep, rich blues of twilight, the first stars pricking through in bright, steady points. As the fires burned, the rocks around them seemed to hold the memory of the day's heat, radiating a faint warmth that made the evening more comfortable. Meals were simple but filling, flatbread softened over the flames, lentils cooked slowly with herbs, and dates that offered a sweet finish to the day. The night settled gradually, the horizon melting into darkness until only the fires and the wide arc of the stars remained. Beyond the glow of the camp, the desert was a vast, shadowed sea, its dunes resting in silence under the moon's pale light. The camels shifted occasionally, their harness bells giving off a faint chime that seemed to blend with the whisper of the wind against the rocks. For the men who traveled these routes, nights like this were a familiar comfort, a pause in the long journey where the body could rest and the mind could drift, knowing that the road would still be there in the morning. Wrapped in their robes, the traders lay on woven mats or directly on the sand, the rocky walls rising protectively around them. The fires burned low, their embers glowing softly, and the quiet deepened until it seemed the whole desert had settled into the same slow rhythm of breath. Overhead, the constellations turned in their eternal path, marking the hours until dawn would come again, and with it, the patient, measured steps of another day's travel across the endless, timeless sands. The first signs of dawn were not in the light, but in the subtle stirring of the air, a faint shift in the coolness that carried with it the quiet promise of morning. Around the rocky outcrop, the camp remained still except for the soft movements of the camel handlers rising from their mats, adjusting their robes, and walking with deliberate care so as not to disturb the deep rest of those still lying under the stars. The fires from the night before had long since gone out, leaving only pale ash that was brushed gently aside. Overhead, the constellations were fading one by one, their steady brilliance yielding to a delicate gray that began to touch the edges of the horizon. The camels, still kneeling in the sand, turned their heads slowly, blinking in the half-light as the handlers approached to prepare them for the day. The leather straps were checked, the loads tightened with practiced efficiency, and each bundle was balanced with the patience born of countless mornings just like this. Water was poured sparingly into shallow bowls, enough to refresh the animals without exhausting the precious supply, and the sound of their quiet drinking echoed softly in the stillness. As the sky shifted from gray to pale gold, the guide stood at a higher point on the rocks, gazing out over the land ahead. His eyes traced the ridges and valleys of the dunes, noting the faint shadows that hinted at firmer ground, the wind-shaped curves that would be easier to cross, and the darker lines where the sand held more moisture. He knew that the day's journey would take them deeper into the heart of the desert, toward a stretch where the landmarks were fewer and the heat more demanding. When the first rays of the sun broke over the horizon, the caravan began to move. The pace was slow at first, the camels finding their rhythm, their long legs lifting and placing each step with unhurried certainty. The handlers walked alongside or slightly ahead, their robes brushing against the sand, their faces half covered to guard against the morning chill that would soon give way to heat. The desert in this early light seemed softer, its vastness muted by the gentle glow, the shadows of the dunes long and cool across the pale surface. From the rocks behind them, the campsite quickly became just another part of the landscape, blending into the shapes and colors until it was indistinguishable from the desert itself. The sounds of the morning were few: the low, steady breaths of the camels, the occasional creak of a rope adjusting under its load, and the faint murmur of voices as the travelers exchanged a few quiet words. Ahead, the horizon was a smooth, unbroken line, the kind that could seem to shift and stretch endlessly as the day wore on. Yet for those who knew this route, each step carried them closer to the next unseen waypoint, a place known not by walls or towers, but by memory, by stories told and retold beside countless night fires. As the sun climbed higher, the air began to warm, the golden light sharpening until it lay across the desert like a thin, glowing veil. The caravan pressed forward, steady and sure, carrying with it not only the goods bound for distant markets, but also the unbroken rhythm of a journey that had been repeated across centuries, each day a continuation of the last, each path a thread woven into the endless fabric of the trade routes of Timbuktu. By mid-morning, the sun had risen high enough to soften the cool edges of the early light, and the desert began to take on its full, bright expanse. The caravan moved steadily, the line of camels and handlers tracing a slow, deliberate path between long ridges of sand, whose crests shimmered faintly in the growing heat. The guide led them toward a place known to only a few, a hidden well that lay in a shallow basin, surrounded by low mounds that broke the monotony of the open plain. This well was not marked by any visible structure, yet its location was etched into the minds of those who had traveled these routes for years, passed down in stories and careful instruction from elder to apprentice. The approach to it was quiet. The travelers knew the importance of conserving energy, their steps leaving soft impressions that the wind would erase by evening. As they neared the basin, the land dipped slightly, and the color of the sand shifted to a richer tone, hinting at the moisture beneath. The camels seemed to sense it too, their pace quickening just enough to suggest recognition. The handlers began to loosen the loads in preparation for the pause, the leather straps releasing with a faint creak. Once the animals were unburdened, they were led to the edge of the well, where a small worn pulley hung above a narrow shaft. Drawing water here was an unhurried ritual. A bucket lowered slowly into the darkness, the quiet splash as it met the surface below, then the steady pull upward, the rope sliding against calloused palms. The water that emerged was cool and faintly sweet, poured into shallow troughs for the camels and into metal cups for the men. Around the well, the air felt just a little fresher, touched by the faint scent of damp earth that was rare in this part of the desert. The traders sat in the partial shade cast by the mounds, passing cups of tea brewed from the water they had just drawn, its flavor richer than that carried from the last oasis. Simple food was shared: flatbread torn into pieces, dried figs, and a handful of almonds, eaten slowly as the breeze shifted gently across the basin. Conversation was sparse, but there was a shared sense of gratitude for this place, a quiet acknowledgement that without such wells, the long trade routes would be impossible. Beyond the basin, the desert stretched in every direction, its vastness unbroken except for the faint line of the route they would follow once more. The pause was brief, for the journey ahead still held many hours of travel before the next stop. Loads were secured again, each bundle balanced carefully, the camels kneeling patiently until given the signal to rise. The guide took one last look at the well, ensuring it was left as they had found it, then turned his gaze toward the horizon. With the sun now leaning toward midday, the caravan set out once more, their figures gradually blending into the rippling light, carrying forward the timeless rhythm of the road, step after measured step, deeper into the endless heart of the desert. The hours after leaving the hidden well were the most demanding of the day, for the sun now sat high in the sky, pouring its steady weight of heat over the desert without mercy. The air shimmered with a wavering light that made the horizon seem to ripple and shift, turning distant dunes into shapes that dissolved as the caravan approached. The camels moved with their usual patient stride, unhurried yet constant, their long necks swaying gently, their padded feet pressing soundlessly into the hot sand. The handlers kept their faces veiled, eyes narrowed against the brightness, their robes absorbing the heat, but shielding them from the harsh glare. Each step was measured, conserving energy, for the desert rewarded only those who respected its pace. Conversation was minimal. The soft clink of harness rings and the muted creak of leather straps were the only regular sounds, blending with the slow, rhythmic breathing of the animals. From time to time, the guide glanced skyward, noting the position of the sun, then back toward the landscape, scanning for subtle changes in the texture and color of the sand that would signal the approach of firmer ground or a landmark known only to seasoned travelers. The route ahead stretched across a broad expanse with little variation, the dunes low and rolling, the surface marked occasionally by faint trails left by other caravans in recent days. In this heat, the mind turned inward, thoughts slowing to match the body's pace, and the journey became a meditation of movement. Each step no different from the last, yet each bringing them closer to their destination. A few times, they passed the remains of ancient caravan markers, half-buried posts or weathered piles of stone, silent reminders of those who had walked these paths centuries before. Their journeys folded into the same endless rhythm. The camels' shadows, short now under the midday sun, began to lengthen as the hours passed and the light slowly softened. Far ahead, the faint rise of darker land hinted at the next waypoint, a cluster of low hills where the ground would be cooler and the air touched by evening winds. The promise of shade and rest gave the caravan a quiet momentum, yet no one hurried. The desert had its own time, and to rush was to invite mistakes. As the afternoon wore on, the temperature eased, and a faint breeze began to move across the open plain, carrying with it the dry scent of stone and the distant memory of water. The guide signaled a gradual turn toward the hills, and the caravan shifted in a slow arc, their long line bending like a brushstroke across the pale surface. The sun, now dipping lower, cast a warmer glow, tinting the sand in shades of amber and gold. Ahead lay the shelter they had aimed for since morning, and with it the quiet certainty that another day's long march was drawing toward its close, to be followed by the familiar rituals of evening, unloading, tending the camels, lighting small fires, and settling once more under the wide, unbroken sky of the desert night. By the time the caravan reached the base of the low hills, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows that stretched across the sand like dark ribbons. The heat of the day was loosening its hold, replaced by the first hints of evening coolness that whispered through the dry air. The hills themselves were gentle slopes of weathered stone, their surfaces warm from the day, but already losing heat to the open sky above. The guide led the caravan into a shallow valley between two ridges, where the sand was firmer and the wind softer, a place known to generations of travelers as a reliable shelter for the night. The camels, sensing the end of the day's journey, knelt almost as soon as their loads were untied, folding their long legs beneath them with practiced ease. The handlers worked with quiet coordination, arranging the bundles of goods in neat rows and checking each strap and knot for wear. A few men climbed partway up the ridge to collect small branches and pieces of dried brush, brought down carefully to start the evening fires. Soon the faint crackle of flames mingled with the low murmur of voices, the sound carrying only a short distance before dissolving into the vast stillness of the desert. Tea was brewed first, its sharp, sweet aroma curling into the cooling air, followed by simple meals. Flatbread warmed over the fire, lentils simmered in small metal pots, dates and dried figs passed from hand to hand. As they ate, the men spoke in low tones, sharing short stories of past journeys, news from markets far behind them, or quiet plans for the days ahead. Above, the sky deepened into shades of indigo and violet, the first stars beginning to emerge and glimmer faintly. The fires cast warm circles of light against the stone walls, the shadows of the camels stretching and swaying gently as they shifted in the sand. Beyond the glow of the camp, the desert lay silent, its surface dim under the rising moon, the dunes blending into soft, indistinct shapes. The air carried a faint coolness now, and the men wrapped their robes tighter, settling near the fires to drink one last cup of tea before rest. One by one, conversations faded, and the camp grew quieter, the only sounds the occasional chime of a camel's harness bell or the soft sigh of wind over stone. The fires burned down to embers, their light fading to a gentle glow that matched the stars overhead. The traders and handlers lay on woven mats, their faces turned toward the open sky, letting the constellations slowly drift across their vision until sleep took hold. In the stillness, the hills seemed to cradle the camp, holding it safe for the night, just as they had for countless caravans before. And as the desert settled into its deep, unbroken silence, the long trade routes of Timbuktu stretched onward into the darkness, waiting for the next dawn to call the travelers forward once more. That was the end of our previous story. Before we begin the next one, may I kindly ask you for a like and a subscribe. And now let us continue with the next story in our Boring History for Sleep series, The Builders of Angkor Wat. That was the end of our previous story. Before we begin the next one, may I kindly ask you for a like and a subscribe. And now let us continue with the next story in our Boring History for Sleep series, The Builders of Angkor Wat. In the quiet light of early morning, long before the first rays of the sun touched the tallest spires of Angkor Wat, the vast temple complex lay shrouded in a soft mist rising from the surrounding moats. The water reflected the pale glow of the sky, broken only by the faint ripples of fish moving beneath the surface. Beyond the outer causeway, the silhouettes of sandstone towers loomed like shadowed mountains, their carved surfaces hidden in the dimness, but alive in memory for those who had shaped them. The air was still cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and the resin of nearby forests, and somewhere in the distance, the muffled rhythm of footsteps began to approach. These were the builders, stonemasons, sculptors, haulers, and artisans. Emerging from the workers' village at the edge of the temple grounds, they walked in silence, each carrying the tools of their craft. Chisels worn smooth from use, wooden mallets, measuring cords, and baskets for carrying smaller pieces of stone. Their pace was steady, for they knew that the work ahead was as enduring as the stone itself, a labor not for a day or a year, but for generations. The sandstone blocks they shaped had been quarried miles away and transported here by an intricate system of canals and rafts, each block weighing as much as several men. Upon arrival, they were laid out in precise order, awaiting the careful hands that would fit them into the temple's rising walls. As the mist began to thin, the outlines of the causeway became clearer, and the builders crossed it slowly, their footsteps echoing softly against the stone slabs. Some moved toward the unfinished outer galleries, where carvings of battles and celestial scenes waited to be completed. Others climbed scaffolds of bamboo lashed together with rope, their feet finding each step with practiced ease. In the courtyards, teams worked in quiet coordination, the sound of chisel on stone blending into a steady, rhythmic pattern that seemed to mark the passage of time itself. Nearby, sculptors sat cross-legged before large blocks of sandstone, their eyes focused on the faint chalk lines that guided their hands as they released figures of gods, dancers, and guardians from the unyielding stone. Every line, every curve was shaped with patience, for each surface told a story meant to last as long as the temple stood. In another corner, craftsmen polished the already carved panels, rubbing them with fine sand until they gleamed in the soft light, ready to catch the glow of the rising sun. The work was demanding, yet it carried a quiet dignity, for the builders knew they were shaping not just walls and corridors, but a vision of the heavens on earth. Above them, the tallest central tower stood complete, its lotus-shaped crown just visible through the thinning mist, a reminder of what their hands could achieve. The morning would stretch into day, the cool air giving way to heat. But in these early hours, the work began in harmony with the stillness, as if the temple itself breathed with them, stone by stone, toward the completion of something meant to endure beyond the reach of time. As the sun began to climb above the tree line, its warm light spilled slowly across the temple grounds, illuminating the carvings and stone surfaces that had been hidden in shadow. The mist retreated toward the moat, leaving the air clear and touched with the faint scent of lotus flowers drifting from the still water. The pace of work shifted with the light. The builders, now fully awake and warmed by the day, moved with quiet focus, each team tending to a different part of the immense structure. Along the western gallery, masons worked side by side, fitting new sandstone blocks into the growing walls with remarkable precision. Wooden cranes, operated by teams of men pulling on thick ropes, lifted the heavy stones from the ground to the scaffolding above. Each block was guided into place with the help of long wooden poles, nudged gently until it fit seamlessly against its neighbors. Once set, the seams were smoothed by hand, leaving no visible gap for time to erode. In the eastern courtyard, the sculptors labored in a rhythm as steady as the shadows creeping along the ground. They traced figures of gods and mythic scenes onto stone panels, their chalk lines forming the outlines of celestial dancers, chariots, and lotus flowers. With mallet and chisel, they cut away the excess stone in small, deliberate strokes, each tap echoing faintly against the surrounding walls. Above them, high on the scaffolds, artisans carved patterns into the lintels and columns, leaning close to ensure each line matched the sacred geometry that guided the temple's design. The sun's light caught in the freshly polished surfaces, making them glow faintly as if lit from within. Near the central tower, a team of workers carried baskets of fine sand and groundstone, used to polish the carvings until they gleamed smooth under the hand. The sound of their work was softer, a gentle brushing that contrasted with the sharper ring of chisels in other parts of the complex. In shaded corners, some of the older craftsmen paused to drink water from clay jars, their faces lined from years of labor under the tropical sun, their eyes still sharp with the knowledge of their trade. Young apprentices watched closely, learning the techniques not through written plans, but through repetition, imitation, and the quiet correction of a master's hand. The entire site moved with a rhythm that felt almost like breathing, lifting, placing, carving, polishing, an endless cycle that had been repeated each day for years. Overhead, the sky was now a deep, brilliant blue, and the heat was beginning to gather in the open courtyards. Still, the builders worked without hurry or complaint, for they understood that the temple was larger than any one man's lifetime. Every stone set today would stand long after their own names had been forgotten, carrying forward the vision of the king and the devotion of all who had labored here. From the tallest scaffolding, one could see the vast expanse of forest stretching away in every direction, a green sea from which the towers of Angkor Wat rose like islands. The morning was nearly over, but the work of the day had only just begun, and the sound of chisels, mallets, and quiet voices would continue to weave through the temple's corridors until the light began to fade once more. By midday, the sun was high above Angkor Wat, its golden light pouring down over the sandstone towers and flooding the courtyards with heat that shimmered faintly in the air. The deep blue of the morning sky had softened to a pale, hazy brightness, and the shadows beneath the galleries had drawn closer to the walls, offering a welcome strip of shade for those working along the edges. The builders adapted to the changing conditions with a quiet, practiced ease, shifting tasks to match the warmth of the day. In the more exposed courtyards, the teams moved to shaded scaffolds or inner chambers, where the air remained cooler, carrying their tools and materials without breaking the steady rhythm of work. The sound of chisels striking stone softened, replaced in some corners by the muted scrape of polishing as artisans smoothed carvings already complete. Near the base of the central tower, groups of workers assembled smaller decorative elements, delicate lotus finials, carved pedestals for statues, and lintels adorned with repeating floral patterns, pieces that could be shaped in partial shade before being lifted into place when the afternoon light shifted. The smell of warm stone mingled with the faint resinous scent of wood from the bamboo scaffolding, and now and then a breeze moved through the corridors, carrying the fragrance of the surrounding forest into the heart of the complex. In a shaded gallery, sculptors worked on a long bas-relief depicting a legendary battle, their hands moving with patience and precision as they carved ranks of warriors, elephants, and chariots into the stone wall. Each figure was given careful attention. The folds of cloth, the curve of a bow, and the expressions of determination on the faces, all rendered with the intention of lasting centuries. Apprentices carried basins of water to dampen the stone, making the surface easier to shape and keeping the dust from rising into the still air. The older craftsmen, seated cross-legged with chisels in hand, guided the younger workers by example, their corrections silent but exact. Across the complex, in the courtyards that caught the most light, smaller teams were tasked with clearing debris and organizing materials, sorting sandstone blocks by size and shape, ensuring that each would be ready for placement in the right sequence. Every movement served the greater order of construction, and though the heat pressed down heavily, no one moved with haste. In the building of a monument such as this, time was measured not in days, but in the steady accumulation of work done well. Occasionally, the deep, resonant sound of a wooden drum echoed faintly from beyond the temple grounds, a signal from the village or the palace, its meaning understood by all but requiring no interruption to the labor here. As the sun leaned past its highest point, the light began to soften again, and shadows stretched further across the temple floor. The builders knew the most productive hours would return as the afternoon cooled. But for now, the work continued at its measured pace, each tap of chisel and brush of stone bringing the vision of Angkor Wat closer to its timeless completion. As the afternoon light began to mellow, stretching long golden beams across the temple grounds, the builders returned to the heavier tasks that the midday heat had put on pause. The air was still warm, but no longer oppressive, and a faint breeze moved between the towers, stirring the scent of warm stone and distant forest leaves. In the western courtyard, teams gathered around large sandstone blocks that had been shaped earlier in the day, preparing to lift them into place along the outer gallery walls. Wooden cranes, built with thick poles and reinforced by rope lashings, stood ready, their pulleys creaking softly as the first block was hoisted from the ground. The movement was slow and deliberate, every man in the team adjusting his pull so that the stone rose evenly, swaying only slightly before it was guided carefully toward its waiting position. Above, on the bamboo scaffolds that clung to the walls like an intricate web, other workers stood ready to receive the load, calling down instructions in low, steady voices. The block was lowered into place with the precision of many years' practice, its edges fitting seamlessly against the stones already set, the joins so fine that a knife's edge could barely find its way between them. Once the block was secured, masons moved in to smooth the joints, their tools scraping quietly as they ensured the new stone would appear as though it had always been part of the wall. Elsewhere, in the shaded cloisters, sculptors worked with renewed focus on detailed panels, rows of celestial dancers, their limbs graceful and flowing, adorned with elaborate headdresses that took hours to perfect. The rhythm of chisels striking stone was steady and unhurried, blending with the faint call of birds returning to the trees that surrounded the complex. In the central sanctuary, artisans applied the finishing touches to carved columns, polishing them until the surfaces caught the fading sunlight and reflected it in a soft, golden sheen. The entire temple seemed to shift with the light, the carvings deepening in shadow while the towers glowed softly in the warm tones of evening. Apprentices moved between the teams, carrying tools, water, and fresh bamboo poles for reinforcing the scaffolding, their bare feet silent on the stone floors. The pace of the work was calm but purposeful. The builders understood that the hours before sunset were precious, offering cooler air and a light that revealed every line and curve of the stone with clarity. In the distance, the forest canopy was beginning to darken, the sun sinking lower behind its high green wall. But within Angkor Wat, the energy was steady, almost meditative. Each completed stone, each polished carving, was another step toward a vision that extended far beyond the lifetime of any one man here. As the shadows stretched further and the sky deepened to amber, the day's work began to draw toward its natural pause. Yet the quiet determination of the builders did not waver. Every moment in these final hours was used to leave the temple just a little more complete than it had been that morning. The walls rising higher, the carvings growing richer, and the great monument inching closer to its timeless perfection. As the sun sank lower in the sky, the golden light slipping into a deeper amber, the vast expanse of Angkor Wat began its gentle transformation from a place of labor to one of quiet rest. The long shadows of the towers reached across the courtyards, their tips touching the far walls as if to mark the passing of another day. The sound of chisels and mallets faded first, replaced by the low murmur of voices as teams finished their final tasks, setting down tools and wiping the fine dust of sandstone from their hands. High on the bamboo scaffolds, workers carefully descended, their movements slow and deliberate, one hand on the poles, the other gripping the ropes that had guided them all day. On the ground, apprentices collected chisels, hammers, and smoothing stones, placing them into woven baskets to be stored away until the next morning. In one corner of the complex, near the base of the central tower, a group of sculptors inspected their work in the fading light, running calloused fingers over the smooth curves of freshly carved figures to ensure that every detail would stand the test of time. Outside the main galleries, masons brushed away the last traces of dust from newly set blocks, stepping back to see how seamlessly they had joined the ancient structure. As the last rays of sunlight touched the lotus-shaped crown of the central sanctuary, the builders began to drift toward the open causeways leading back to their village. The air was cooler now, carrying with it the faint scent of the surrounding forest and the distant call of birds settling in for the night. Along the wide moat, the water mirrored the sky's soft gradient, pale gold fading into lavender, broken only by the ripples of fish near the surface. Some of the older craftsmen paused on the causeway to look back at the temple, the towers rising in calm silhouette against the deepening colors, as if the day's work had brought it one step closer to perfection. In the village beyond, small fires were lit, their smoke curling slowly upward, and the sounds of evening meals being prepared began to fill the air. The soft clatter of clay pots, the rustle of banana leaves, the gentle sizzle of food cooking over coals. Builders gathered in small groups outside their huts, sitting on low stools or the packed earth, sharing bowls of rice, vegetables, and fish. Their conversation unhurried and threaded with quiet laughter. Children darted between the huts, their voices carrying faintly through the gathering dusk, while elders spoke in low tones about the progress of the temple and the weather to come. Far from the main thoroughfare, some of the younger men lingered near the edge of the forest, speaking softly about the carvings they hoped to complete, the skills they still wished to learn. Overhead, the sky darkened to deep blue, and the first stars appeared, reflected faintly in the still waters of the moat. The day's work had ended, but its presence lingered, in the smooth edges of newly placed stone, in the fine patterns etched into the walls, in the quiet pride that each builder carried as they looked toward the temple in the soft night. Soon, the fires in the village would burn lower, voices would fade into the calm of sleep, and Angkor Wat would stand once more in silence, waiting for the first light of dawn to summon its builders back to their timeless labor. Before the first light of morning touched the towers of Angkor Wat, the temple and its surrounding forest lay under a deep, quiet darkness, broken only by the soft murmur of insects and the occasional distant call of a night bird. In the workers' village beyond the moat, faint embers and cooking fires glowed in the pre-dawn air, their smoke rising in thin, pale threads. One by one, the builders stirred from their mats, their movements unhurried, voices kept low so as not to break the stillness too abruptly. Water was poured from clay jars for washing, the cool splash echoing faintly in the quiet, and simple morning meals were taken. Steamed rice, a few preserved vegetables, and tea brewed strong to warm the body before the labor ahead. The path to the temple was familiar underfoot, a packed earth track leading to the wide causeway that stretched across the moat like a bridge between two worlds. As they walked, the builders could see the faint outline of the temple's towers against the paling sky, their forms rising steadily into view as the darkness thinned. Crossing the causeway, the sound of sandals on stone echoed softly over the water, which was still and glass-like, mirroring both the towers and the first hints of color in the east. Within the temple grounds, the air was cool and held the scent of damp stone and forest leaves. The tools, stored carefully the evening before, were brought out once more, chisels with their wooden handles smoothed by years of use, mallets darkened from countless strikes, and bundles of measuring cord coiled neatly. The first tasks of the day began in near silence, save for the rhythmic sounds of preparation, the soft scrape of stone being smoothed, the creak of rope as scaffolding was tightened, the muted thud of a mallet striking a block into position. In the galleries, sculptors returned to their panels, their eyes narrowing in concentration as they found their place among the carvings left unfinished the day before. Lines were traced anew, figures took shape in the dim early light, and dust from each precise chisel strike drifted downward in slow spirals. In the open courtyards, masons began lifting smaller stones into place, using wooden cranes and the careful coordination of many hands to fit them seamlessly into the rising walls. The morning light grew gradually stronger, turning from pale silver to warm gold as it touched the temple's lotus-crowned towers. Birds moved through the air above the complex, their wings flashing briefly in the sun before they disappeared into the surrounding forest. The work now carried a quiet momentum, each man focused yet attuned to the presence of others, every movement part of a larger, unspoken rhythm. In these hours before the heat arrived, the builders made their most steady progress, knowing that the day ahead would bring both challenge and reward. The temple, vast and patient, seemed to absorb each stroke of their tools, each breath of their effort, holding it within the stone as part of the story that would outlast them all. As the morning unfolded and the sun rose higher over the horizon, the golden light that had first touched the temple's towers began to spill fully into the courtyards, bathing the sandstone walls in a soft but growing warmth. The cool air of dawn gradually gave way to a heavier stillness, and the builders adjusted their pace with the same unhurried discipline they had learned from years of labor in this tropical climate. In the outer galleries, masons worked in the shade, fitting shaped blocks into the unfinished walls, their hands steady as they tapped each stone into place with a mallet, checking the alignment with lengths of cord stretched taut from one end of the wall to the other. Near the main sanctuary, scaffolds of bamboo rose like lattices against the sky, and teams moved carefully up and down their narrow walkways, carrying chisels, baskets of smaller stones, and coils of rope. The air here was filled with the quiet ring of metal against stone, a sound softened by the thickness of the temple's walls. Farther inside, where the corridors were cooler and the light filtered through narrow windows, sculptors continued their work on the intricate bas-reliefs that told stories of gods, kings, and mythical battles. Their chisels traced the flowing lines of garments, the fine strands of hair, and the gentle curves of lotus petals, each detail carved with a patience that seemed to erase the passing of time. In a shaded corner of the eastern courtyard, apprentices polished completed panels, their hands moving in slow circles with fine sand and water, the surface gradually becoming smooth enough to catch the light. The scent of damp stone mingled with the faint aroma of resin from freshly cut bamboo, used for repairs on the scaffolding. Occasionally, the workers paused to drink from clay jars filled with cool water brought from the moat earlier that morning, each sip small but refreshing. Overhead, the sky was a clear, steady blue, and the sun's heat pressed more firmly on the open spaces. Even so, the work continued without complaint, for each builder knew that every stone set and every carving completed brought the great temple closer to its final vision. In the distance, the sound of a gong drifted faintly from the village, marking the hour. But within the temple grounds, the rhythm of labor did not falter. The harmony of movement, lifting, fitting, carving, polishing, was as much a part of the structure as the stone itself. By late morning, the builders were well into their tasks, the earlier coolness now a memory, yet their pace remained steady, measured, and deliberate, as if the temple's enduring presence lent them its own patience. The light, shifting gradually across the walls, revealed new details in the carvings, and the air seemed to hold a quiet promise that the day's labor, like all those before it, would leave something behind that would stand for centuries. By midday, the heat lay heavy over Angkor Wat, the golden tones of morning giving way to a brighter, almost white light that poured across the temple grounds and pressed against the stone walls until they radiated warmth. The air shimmered faintly above the wide courtyards, and the builders shifted their work into the deeper galleries and shaded corridors, where the sunlight filtered softly through narrow openings and the air remained cooler. In these quieter spaces, the sound of labor took on a gentler tone, the steady scrape of tools polishing surfaces, the muted tap of chisels carving fine details into stone, the occasional soft brush of cloth as dust was wiped from a newly finished relief. In the eastern wing, a group of sculptors sat cross-legged before a long panel depicting a celestial procession, their hands moving with unhurried precision as they shaped the faces of dancers, each expression unique, yet part of a harmonious whole. Farther inside, teams worked on smaller architectural details, intricate floral motifs for column capitals, the delicate curves of naga serpents that would guard stairways, the repeating patterns that framed doorways. The air smelled faintly of damp stone, mingled with the dry, woody scent of bamboo, used for scaffolding repairs. Apprentices moved quietly between the workers, carrying bowls of water to dampen the stone and keep the dust down, refilling clay jars so the craftsmen could drink in small, careful sips. Outside, in the open courtyards, only the most essential tasks continued, a few masons setting lighter stones into place with careful alignment, their robes pulled close against the sun's glare. The rest of the labor was concentrated in the shaded heart of the complex, where the dim light made the carvings appear almost alive, their shadows deepening the folds of garments and the petals of lotus flowers. Every so often, a faint breeze moved through the corridors, carrying with it the distant rustle of leaves from the forest beyond the moat. The pace of the work was slow, deliberate, and steady, each movement conserving energy for the long hours of the afternoon. In these moments, the temple seemed to exist apart from the passage of time, its rising walls and completed towers holding both the silence of centuries and the quiet hum of present labor. The builders knew that the sun would soften again as it dipped toward the horizon, allowing for heavier work to resume. But until then, the shaded interiors became their refuge, a place where the rhythm of chisel and mallet continued in keen harmony with the heartbeat of the great monument they were bringing to life. As the afternoon advanced and the sun began its slow descent, the harsh brightness of midday softened into a warmer, golden light that spilled gently across the temple's vast courtyards. The heat eased its grip, and a faint breeze moved in from the surrounding forest, rustling the tops of the palm trees beyond the moat. The builders emerged gradually from the shaded galleries where they had spent the hottest hours, returning to the outer courtyards and open scaffolds with a renewed steadiness. This was the time for heavier work once again, lifting and placing larger stones, setting decorative lintels into position, and reinforcing the bamboo scaffolding in preparation for the next day's progress. In the western courtyard, teams worked with wooden cranes and ropes, guiding a massive sandstone block into the upper wall of a gallery. The creak of the ropes and the deep rhythmic calls of the men coordinating the lift echoed faintly off the stone surfaces, blending with the softer background sounds of chisels at work nearby. On the higher levels, artisans carved details into recently set stones, leaning close to ensure each curve matched the temple's intricate design. The light at this hour revealed every detail with clarity: the fine lines of lotus petals, the sharp edges of geometric patterns, the expressive features of figures frozen in mythic scenes. In the eastern side of the complex, sculptors sat in small groups at the base of a half-finished relief, their tools moving in steady, deliberate strokes as they brought new life to the ancient stories told in stone. Apprentices carried water to dampen the carvings and keep the dust low, their movements quick but careful as they stepped over cords and tools. The air was filled with the mingled scents of warm stone, bamboo, and faint traces of smoke drifting from distant cooking fires in the village. Above, the towers glowed in the late sunlight, their lotus-shaped crowns bathed in amber tones that deepened with every passing moment. The builders, though tired from the day's work, moved with quiet focus, aware that these final hours of light were precious. Each stone placed, each carving completed before the sun dipped too low, would stand as a small but enduring part of the great whole. As the shadows stretched longer across the courtyards and the sky began to shift toward the soft colors of evening, the sounds of labor slowed but did not yet cease. The rhythm of the temple's construction continued until the very edge of daylight, the builders working in a harmony as constant and enduring as the monument itself, their efforts weaving seamlessly into the fabric of a structure meant to stand for centuries beyond their time. As the last golden rays of the day brushed against the highest lotus-shaped towers of Angkor Wat, the vast complex began to slow into the measured stillness of evening. The warm amber glow on the sandstone gradually faded into deeper shades, the carvings along the galleries taking on softer outlines as the light retreated. The calls of the foremen grew quieter, replaced by the low murmur of workers concluding their final tasks. High on the bamboo scaffolds, artisans descended carefully, their hands gripping the smooth poles polished by countless climbs, their tools tucked securely into woven baskets slung over their shoulders. On the ground, masons brushed the day's dust from newly set stones, stepping back to see the seamless lines between each block, a sign that their work would endure the centuries. Sculptors laid down their chisels, the fine details of unfinished figures to be continued in the morning, and apprentices began gathering tools, coiling ropes, and stacking unused materials neatly against the gallery walls. The scent of warm stone lingered in the air, mingled now with the faint aroma of smoke drifting from the village beyond the moat. The soundscape shifted too, the steady rhythm of chisels and mallets replaced by the distant calls of birds settling in the trees, the soft splash of fish breaking the water's surface, and the gentle rustle of leaves as the evening breeze moved through the surrounding forest. The builders began to make their way along the wide causeway leading away from the temple, their silhouettes long and fluid against the fading light, carrying the quiet fatigue of a day's labor well spent. Some paused for a moment midway across, turning to look back at the towers rising in serene silhouette against a sky now touched with violet and gold, as if to remind themselves of the purpose that drew them here each morning. In the village, small fires flickered to life, casting warm circles of light on the ground as families prepared the evening meal. Bowls of rice, vegetables stewed in earthen pots, fish wrapped in banana leaves and roasted slowly over coals. Laughter mingled with the gentle crackle of the fires, children's voices carrying softly through the air as they darted between huts. Elder craftsmen sat in small groups, speaking in low tones about the day's progress, their words measured and thoughtful. The heat of the day had fully given way to the soft coolness of night, and above, the first stars began to appear, mirrored faintly in the still waters of the moat. Soon the village would quiet, the fires would burn lower, and sleep would come easily to those whose bodies were tired from the steady work of shaping stone. Beyond the village, in the darkness of the temple grounds, Angkor Wat stood silent once more, the day's labors folded into its walls, its towers watching over the night as they had for countless evenings past, waiting patiently for the first light of dawn to summon the builders back to continue their timeless work. That was the end of our previous story. Before we begin the next one, may I kindly ask you for a like and a subscribe. And now, let us continue with the next story. In our Boring History for Sleep series, how paper traveled from China to the world. In the quiet corridors of history, the story of paper begins more than 2,000 years ago in ancient China, in a world where words and images were preserved on silk, bamboo, and wooden tablets, materials that were costly, heavy, or difficult to produce in large quantities. It was during the Eastern Han Dynasty, in the 1st century of our era, that a court official named Kai Lun is credited with refining a process that would change the course of human communication. Using the bark of mulberry trees, scraps of hemp, old fishing nets, and rags, he created a pulp that could be spread thin, pressed, and dried into smooth, flexible sheets. The result was lighter than bamboo, less expensive than silk, and durable enough to be rolled, folded, and stored with ease. At first, this remarkable invention was confined to the imperial court and the scholarly elite, its value understood not only for its practicality, but for its potential to record the thoughts, laws, and art of an entire civilization. Workshops began to appear in the provinces, where artisans soaked raw fibers in large vats, pounded them into pulp with wooden mallets, and dipped framed screens into the mixture to form sheets. The sheets were then laid out to dry in the sun, their surfaces later polished with smooth stones to make them suitable for calligraphy and painting. The spread of paper within China was gradual but inevitable. Scholars copied classics onto it, government offices recorded taxes and decrees, and poets found in its clean surface a new freedom to refine their verses. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, paper had begun to replace earlier materials entirely for official and literary purposes. Still, the outside world remained unaware of this transformation, for China guarded the knowledge of papermaking as closely as it would guard the secrets of silk. The route by which paper would eventually leave China began not with merchants, but with movement along the vast network of trade paths we now call the Silk Road. These routes carried silk, spices, jade, and ceramics to lands far to the west, and in return brought glassware, precious metals, and horses. Caravans moved slowly across deserts and mountains, stopping at oasis towns where news, languages, and customs mingled. It was along these same paths that, centuries later, paper would travel, carried in bales by traders who understood its value, though not yet the guarded methods of its creation. The journey from the heart of China toward the frontiers was long and often perilous. crossing vast stretches of open land where wind and sand could erase the trail within hours, passing through mountain passes where snow lingered late into spring. Yet, as with all great exchanges of history, the movement of paper was as much about the people who carried it as it was about the object itself. Scribes, scholars, and traders who recognized that these thin sheets held a quiet power to preserve the words and images of one place and carry them intact into another. At the dawn of its travels beyond China's borders, paper was still a rare and precious commodity, folded into chests and wrapped carefully in cloth, awaiting the moment when it would enter a wider world and begin the long journey toward becoming one of humanity's most enduring and universal tools. The first steps of paper's long journey beyond China began quietly, carried not in great caravans laden with riches, but in the modest bundles of traders and envoys moving westward along the intricate web of routes that formed the Silk Road. These paths wound through deserts and over mountain passes, linked by oasis towns where languages mingled, goods changed hands, and news flowed as freely as water from the wells. In the centuries after Kailun's refinement of papermaking, the craft remained a closely guarded secret in China. But paper itself, light to carry, useful in every place, was less easy to contain. Rolls and sheets found their way into the packs of merchants traveling toward Central Asia, where the novelty of the material caught the attention of scribes and rulers alike. At first, it was used for letters between courts, folded and sealed in wax, the crisp surface a welcome alternative to the heavier parchment or the brittle palm leaves more common in distant lands. In the oasis cities of Khotan and Kashgar, where the air was dry and the streets bustled with traders from Persia, India, and Byzantium, paper began to appear in markets at Sank, alongside silks and spices, its price reflecting its rarity. Travelers from faraway places examined its texture, marveling at how it could be rolled without cracking, how it took ink cleanly without smudging. Yet the knowledge of how to make it remained elusive, locked behind the guarded walls of Chinese workshops. From these Central Asian crossroads, paper continued westward, borne by caravans that moved slowly through the Taklamakan Desert, past wind-worn watchtowers and long stretches of barren land, where the only shelter came from low earthen walls built centuries earlier to guide travelers. The journey was slow and often dangerous. Sandstorms could erase the path in moments, and bandits haunted the narrow passes where the route climbed into the high mountains. Still, the traders carried paper forward, knowing that in the great cities to the west, it would command high value. In Samarkand, one of the jewels of the Silk Road, merchants presented it to scholars and calligraphers, who prized its smoothness for the intricate scripts of Arabic and Persian writing. Here, under the bright domes and bustling bazaars, paper began to take root. Not yet produced locally, but treasured as a medium that seemed destined to replace older, more cumbersome writing materials. It was in such places, where cultures overlapped and the movement of goods was constant, that paper's true journey began, not just as an object to be traded, but as an idea to be learned, adapted, and eventually claimed by the hands of new makers. This was the beginning of the transformation that would carry paper far beyond the deserts and mountains, into the libraries, courts, and markets of lands that had never before known such a thing, setting the stage for its spread across continents. By the early 8th century, the steady trickle of paper along the Silk Road had reached a turning point in the city of Samarkand, a vibrant hub of trade and culture where merchants from every direction converged under the bright sun of Central Asia. Here, among the turquoise domes and bustling markets, paper was no longer just a curiosity from the East. It was becoming an object of real demand, sought by scribes, scholars, and administrators who saw its potential to transform the way knowledge was recorded and preserved. Samarkand was well placed for such a transformation, for it sat at the crossroads of empires and ideas, its streets echoing with many languages, and its workshops alive with the sounds of craft. The turning point came in the year 751, when history tells of the Battle of Talas between the forces of the Tang dynasty and the Abbasid Caliphate. Among the prisoners taken by the Abbasids, it is said, were Chinese artisans skilled in the art of papermaking. Whether this account is entirely true or partly legend, it marks the moment when the guarded techniques of turning plant fibers into sheets began to slip beyond China's borders. In Samarkand, the craft took root quickly. Local artisans adapted the Chinese methods to the materials at hand, using flax and hemp in place of mulberry bark, pounding the fibers into pulp and forming sheets on wooden frames. The city's clear river water proved ideal for rinsing and processing the pulp, while the dry climate allowed the sheets to dry evenly in the open air. Within a generation, Samarkand was producing paper of its own, fine enough to rival the imports from the East and durable enough to withstand years of use. The adoption of paper here was more than a change in material. It was a shift in the rhythm of daily life. In the markets, merchants began recording their accounts on the smooth sheets. In the mosques and schools, scholars copied the Quran and other texts with greater ease than before. In the courts, decrees and treaties could be written in clear, compact script and stored without the bulk of parchment. Word of Samarkand's paper spread quickly along the trade routes. Bales of it were loaded onto caravans heading west toward Persia and the Arab heartlands, while others traveled east again, reaching cities already familiar with the Chinese version, but now curious about this new, locally made variety. In this way, Samarkand became not only a link in the chain of paper's journey, but one of its great turning points. A place where an invention from a distant empire took on new life, shaped by the hands, resources, and needs of another culture, setting it on a path that would carry it even farther toward the heart of the known world. From Samarkand, the journey of paper flowed steadily westward into the heart of the Islamic world, carried by caravans that wound their way through Persia's fertile valleys, over mountain passes, and across stretches of desert where the only relief came from small, bustling caravanserais. In each city along the way, Bukhara, Nishapur, Rai, paper became a little less exotic and a little more essential. Merchants wrapped their goods in it, scribes copied contracts upon it, and scholars began to prefer it over parchment for its lightness and ease of use. By the late 8th century, the arrival of paper in Baghdad marked a decisive chapter in its history. Baghdad, then the glittering capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, was the center of a golden age of knowledge, where translators, mathematicians, astronomers, poets, and philosophers gathered under the patronage of caliphs eager to collect the wisdom of the world. In this thriving city, the introduction of paper met with immediate enthusiasm. The Caliph al-Mansur and his successors saw its potential not only for administration, but for scholarship. The famous Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, became one of the first great institutions to embrace it fully, commissioning the translation of works from Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit into Arabic on this smooth new medium. Workshops known as paper mills sprang up along the Tigris, using linen rags and hemp to produce sheets in large quantities. The process refined in Samarkand was improved in Baghdad. Pulp beaten finer, sheets pressed smoother, and edges trimmed more evenly. The availability of paper began to transform daily life. Clerks could produce multiple copies of official decrees without exhausting supplies of costly parchment. Poets could circulate their verses more widely, and scholars could keep notebooks filled with observations, sketches, and calculations. Markets began to include stalls devoted entirely to paper, inks, and writing instruments, catering to a growing literate class. The visual culture of the Islamic world adapted quickly to paper's qualities. Calligraphers found that it absorbed ink beautifully, allowing for more fluid scripts and intricate ornamentation. Illuminators applied gold and colored pigments to its surface, creating manuscripts that shimmered like jewels. The speed with which ideas could now be copied and shared contributed to an unprecedented exchange of knowledge across the empire, from the libraries of Cairo to the courts of Al-Andalus in far-off Spain. By the 9th century, paper was no longer a rare commodity in Baghdad. It had become the foundation of an intellectual network that stretched across continents. Yet even as it spread farther west, the memory of its eastern origins lingered, carried in the stories of traders who spoke of distant China, of the guarded workshops of old, and of the winding roads that had brought this remarkable invention into the hands of those who would carry it onward still. From the bustling markets and scholarly halls of Baghdad, paper's journey continued westward, carried along the arteries of trade that threaded through the Islamic world toward the shores of North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula. Caravans moved slowly across the deserts of Arabia, stopping at waypoints where merchants, scholars, and travelers exchanged news beneath the shade of palm groves. In port cities along the Mediterranean, bales of paper were loaded onto ships bound for distant harbors, their cargoes wrapped carefully against the salt air and spray. In Egypt, paper found fertile ground in Cairo and Fustat. where the Nile's markets were filled with scribes offering to write letters, copy legal documents, and record transactions for those who could not read or write themselves. The papyrus that had once defined Egypt's writing culture was already in decline, and paper, more durable and easier to produce in bulk, quickly took its place. From there, paper crossed the sea to the Maghreb, arriving in cities like Fez and Marrakesh, where scholars of theology, law, and science gathered in madrasas, whose libraries began to swell with bound volumes written on this versatile new medium. In these North African centers, paper was not only a practical material, but a symbol of intellectual connection to the great cultural capitals of the East. Skilled craftsmen refined local production techniques, often using linen rags collected from households, pounding them into pulp with wooden hammers powered by water wheels, and drying the sheets in the warm sun. The trade winds carried paper further still, across the narrow Strait of Gibraltar into Al-Andalus, the Muslim-ruled territories of the Iberian Peninsula. Cities like Córdoba, Toledo, and Granada became new homes for paper's flourishing use. In Córdoba, with its grand libraries and famous scholars, paper became the medium on which translations of Greek philosophy and scientific works were copied into Arabic, preserved, and later translated into Latin. Calligraphers there developed distinctive styles that balanced clarity with beauty, their flowing scripts perfectly suited to the smooth surface of well-made paper. The availability of paper in Al-Andalus fueled a rise in literacy and scholarship, enabling the growth of schools and institutions that would later pass this knowledge north into Christian Europe. Paper merchants in the bazaars sold it alongside ink, pens, and leather bindings, while craftsmen experimented with watermarks and other identifying marks that would become a part of the paper trade for centuries. By the 11th century, the presence of paper in these Western lands was no longer rare. It had woven itself into the fabric of daily life, from the scribe recording a market sale to the scholar copying the Quran, from the poet composing verses under the lamplight to the judge issuing legal rulings. And yet, beyond the mountains and seas to the north, vast regions of Europe had still not embraced this material, relying instead on parchment as they had for generations. That change was coming, for the same trade routes that had carried paper from China to the edges of the Islamic world were poised to carry it across a cultural frontier, into new lands where it would spark transformations as profound as those it had already kindled along its long and winding path. From the sunlit courtyards of Córdoba and the scholarly halls of Toledo, paper's slow migration into medieval Europe unfolded not in a single dramatic leap, but as a gradual seep through borders, trade fairs, and the quiet hands of merchants. The Christian kingdoms of Spain, engaged in both conflict and exchange with their Muslim neighbors, began to encounter this strange, pliable material that could be folded, sewn, and written upon without the cost of slaughtering animals for parchment. Traders carried it north through the Pyrenees into southern France, where the bustling markets of Narbonne and Montpellier saw small rolls of paper exchanged alongside silk, spices, and fine glassware. In the 12th century, the paper-making craft took its first firm root in Christian Europe at places like Zadova, a town in Valencia already renowned under Muslim rule for producing sheets of remarkable smoothness and durability. From there, knowledge of the process traveled with artisans who migrated or were taken northward, sometimes willingly, sometimes as captives after territorial conquests. Italian merchants, always quick to recognize a commodity's value, began importing paper into the maritime republics, Genoa, Pisa, and especially Venice, where demand from notaries, bankers, and government scribes grew steadily. In Venice's labyrinth of canals, paper from the Islamic world arrived bundled on ships, ready to be transformed into ledgers, recording trade agreements, ship manifests, and legal contracts. By the late 12th and early 13th centuries, the first European paper mills emerged in regions with abundant running water and access to linen rags, such as Fabriano in central Italy. Fabriano would become legendary for innovations like the use of animal gelatin sizing to strengthen sheets and the introduction of wire molds that allowed intricate watermarks, both of which set European paper apart in quality and recognizability. Slowly, monasteries and scriptoria, long devoted to painstakingly copying manuscripts on parchment, began to experiment with paper, especially for less formal documents. It was lighter, easier to fold into quires, and far cheaper, enabling the copying of texts that might otherwise never have been recorded. In France, the adoption of paper was aided by the spread of universities in cities like Paris, where the appetite for affordable writing materials soared alongside the demand for lecture notes and scholarly treatises. Students and scholars could acquire paper in quire form, ready for binding or loose use, from stationers who clustered near the schools. Even so, resistance persisted in certain circles. Many saw parchment as nobler, more enduring, and better suited for sacred or royal texts, while paper was considered fit for commerce or learning, but not for posterity. Yet economic logic, as it so often does, began to prevail. The growing network of paper mills in Italy, Spain, and southern France supplied not only local needs, but also sent bales northward along the Rhone River to Lyon, and from there to the trading hubs of the Low Countries and the German states. In these regions, paper became the unseen backbone of an expanding bureaucratic world, supporting the meticulous records of towns, the correspondence of merchants, and the evolving legal systems of the late Middle Ages. By the mid-13th century, the sight of paper was no longer rare in European cities, though it still carried an air of novelty in rural areas, and its steady integration into the continent's cultural and economic life was setting the stage for the profound transformations it would enable in the centuries to come. Transformations that would not only multiply the written word, but ultimately redefine how knowledge itself was stored, shared, and preserved. By the 14th century, paper was quietly threading itself into the very fabric of European life, moving from the domain of merchants and scholars into the machinery of governance and the rhythms of everyday transactions, its presence so steady and understated that few paused to consider how revolutionary it truly was. In the bustling Italian city-states, where trade agreements stretched from the Baltic to the Levant, paper became the indispensable medium for recording debts, contracts, shipping logs, and letters of credit, the lifeblood of a mercantile system that depended on trust documented in writing. In Florence, the bankers of the Medici family relied on reams of paper to maintain double-entry ledgers, carefully balancing columns of numbers that underpinned the fortunes of kingdoms. Venice, with its sprawling trade network, used paper not only for contracts, but for diplomatic correspondence carried by swift galleys to distant ports, messages sealed with wax and stamped with elaborate crests. North of the Alps, towns like Bruges, Ghent, and Cologne became centers where paper fed the demands of textile guilds, municipal councils, and expanding legal courts. In France, the chanceries of kings and dukes began standardizing the use of paper for certain categories of records, recognizing its cost advantage over parchment when dealing with the sheer volume of petitions, decrees, and receipts. The spread of paper also intersected with the growing sophistication of postal systems, from the mounted couriers of the Hanseatic League to the organized dispatches of the Holy Roman Empire, allowing for more consistent and affordable written communication. Universities, ever hungry for material to feed the minds of their swelling student bodies, became steady customers of the paper trade, and scribes, once restricted by the scarcity of parchment, found themselves able to produce more copies of Aristotle's treatises, legal glossaries, and theological commentaries than ever before. Even artisans and small-town shopkeepers began to use scraps of paper for inventories, notes, and private letters, often reusing the blank sides of older documents in a practical economy of writing. This democratization of access, gradual and uneven, meant that ideas could begin to flow more freely, crossing class and regional boundaries with a speed unknown in earlier centuries. At the same time, the craft of papermaking itself was evolving. Mills in Fabriano, Basel, and Troyes experimented with refining the pulp more finely, producing sheets that were smoother, lighter, and more uniform in size, which made them easier to bind and store. Watermarks, initially a curiosity, became a kind of signature, allowing buyers to identify the origin of their paper and, in some cases, to trust its quality. These developments did not go unnoticed by rulers, who increasingly saw the strategic value of controlling paper production within their realms, both for economic independence and for the secure handling of state correspondence. In England, where paper had been a relative latecomer, merchants and officials began importing more from the continent. And by the later 14th century, London's civic records were already being kept in part on paper. All of these threads, the mercantile, the administrative, the educational, and the personal, were weaving together into a vast, invisible network of written communication that would set the stage for the greatest leap yet in the history of the written word. It was a leap not born of war or conquest, but of quiet, repetitive acts, the turning of a mill wheel, the dipping of a mold into pulp, the careful stacking of sheets to dry in the open air, the scratching of a quill across a fresh page. And though no one in those years could have predicted it, this humble, fibrous medium was preparing Europe for an age in which the speed and reach of ideas would change the world forever. By the mid-15th century, the story of paper and the story of the printing press became so tightly entwined that it is almost impossible to speak of one without the other, for the invention of movable type in Mainz by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450 was only half the revolution. The other half was the ready availability of affordable, workable paper to carry the printed word. Before this moment, manuscripts laboriously copied by scribes could take weeks or months to produce, each one a unique artifact, often on costly parchment. Now, presses could turn out multiple identical pages in a single day. But such a leap in speed and volume would have been unthinkable without a steady supply of uniform sheets. The printing press demanded a paper that was smooth enough for crisp impressions, strong enough to withstand the pressure of the press bed, and cheap enough to make books accessible beyond the narrow elite of church and court. Papermakers, sensing opportunity, refined their methods further, introducing more consistent sizing to prevent ink bleed, improving mold construction to ensure even fiber distribution, and experimenting with linen rag mixtures that produced sheets of both durability and whiteness. The effect was immediate and profound. Suddenly, pamphlets, religious tracts, calendars, and almanacs could reach towns and villages far from any urban scriptorium, and the cost of a book dropped to a fraction of what it had been, placing it within reach of merchants, artisans, and even some farmers. In Venice, Aldus Manutius built a publishing empire that relied on a constant flow of paper to print affordable editions of Greek and Latin classics. While in Nuremberg, Anton Koberger's press sent out Bibles and chronicles that traveled along the same trade routes once dominated by spices and silks. The Reformation would later harness the synergy between print and paper with devastating efficiency, as Martin Luther's theses and sermons, reproduced on thousands of sheets, ignited debates across the Holy Roman Empire and beyond in a matter of weeks rather than years. Education, too, underwent a quiet transformation. Universities could provide students with printed textbooks instead of relying on dictated lectures alone. And literacy began to grow not only among the nobility and clergy, but among townspeople who saw the practical value of reading and writing for trade, governance, and personal advancement. The paper mill became as strategic an asset as a mine or a port, with some rulers imposing tariffs to protect local production, while others granted monopolies to favored families. In France, the Rives mill in Dauphiné gained renown for its fine sheets, sought after by printers in Lyon and Paris. In England, mills at Dartford and later at Maidstone began supplying the London book trade, reducing dependence on imports from the continent. This period also saw the first stirrings of specialized printing beyond books, sheet music for a growing class of amateur musicians, political broadsides aimed at influencing city councils, and illustrated works whose woodcuts demanded paper capable of capturing fine detail. Everywhere, the partnership between the papermaker and the printer reshaped the landscape of knowledge, making the written word not just a tool of record, but a living force in public life. And yet, for all the grandeur of its impact, the daily rhythm of paper's creation remained humble. Rag collectors scouring streets for linen scraps, vats steaming in the dim light of workshops, apprentices lifting dripping molds with practiced care, and sheets hung in airy lofts to dry. These small, repetitive acts, performed by hands that seldom touched the books or pamphlets their labor made possible, formed the invisible foundation of a cultural transformation. Without paper, the printing press would have been a marvel without a future. With it, the printed page became a river of ideas, carrying news, arguments, stories, and dreams from one corner of Europe to another, and soon to distant shores across the seas. By the dawn of the 16th century, the momentum that had carried paper from its origins in China across the Islamic world into Europe's bustling print shops was now pushing it toward entirely new horizons. For European ships were no longer confined to coastal voyages, but were crossing vast oceans, and in their holds, along with spices, tools, weapons, and settlers, they carried reams of paper. In the Spanish colonies of the Americas, paper became as crucial as food or clothing for the functioning of governance, the church, and commerce. Conquistadors and administrators brought paper to record land grants, issue royal decrees, and maintain meticulous ledgers of silver shipments flowing back to Seville. Missionaries used it to translate Christian texts into indigenous languages, creating dictionaries and catechisms in Nahuatl, Quechua, and countless others, while local artists adapted European paper for detailed maps and codices that blended native and European visual traditions. In Mexico City, the first printing press of the New World began operation in 1539, and while paper initially had to be imported from Spain, the demand was so constant that local paper-making experiments began. Though the raw materials often differed, with agave fibers and other native plants supplementing scarce linen rags. Across the Atlantic in English North America, early settlements like Jamestown and Plymouth were too fragile and resource-poor to support papermaking, so colonists relied on expensive imports, which meant that every sheet was used sparingly, often written on both sides, margins crammed with notes, and old documents recycled for wrapping or insulation. Yet as towns grew, the need for a steady supply of paper became urgent, driven by colonial newspapers, legal contracts, and correspondence that bound distant communities together. By the late 17th century, paper mills began appearing along the fast-flowing rivers of New England and Pennsylvania, with water wheels powering the beating of rags into pulp. These colonial mills adapted Old World techniques to New World realities. Rags were collected from households through barter systems, sizing agents were made from locally available materials, and molds were repaired and reused until they could no longer hold a shape. Paper thus became an unassuming but essential thread in the weave of colonial society, enabling the spread of political pamphlets that would one day challenge imperial authority. Meanwhile, in Asia, the story took a different turn. Japanese papermakers, long masters of washi production, began selectively adopting European methods to cater to foreign traders, while in Mughal India, the Persian-inspired tradition of highly polished paper continued to flourish alongside imported European stock, creating a dual market that served both calligraphers and printers. The Ottoman Empire, once cautious about printing, began to allow presses in the 18th century, and when they did, they relied on a mix of locally produced and imported paper to meet the surge in demand for official decrees, educational materials, and newspapers. In Africa, coastal trading posts established by the Portuguese and later the Dutch and British introduced paper to regions where written records had previously been maintained on parchment, bark, or oral tradition alone. Here too, the adaptability of paper to diverse climates and uses allowed it to take root quickly. As the 17th and 18th centuries progressed, the global paper trade formed a network as intricate as the Silk Routes centuries earlier. Bales of paper wrapped in coarse cloth were loaded onto ships in Amsterdam, Genoa, or Lisbon, carried to ports in Brazil, the Caribbean, India, or the Cape of Good Hope, and from there, dispersed into inland markets. Paper's portability meant it could ride with traders on camels into the Sahel, or be packed into canoes navigating the rivers of Southeast Asia. By the eve of the Industrial Revolution, paper had achieved what few inventions manage. It had become truly global, embedded in the daily lives of emperors and peasants alike, its versatility ensuring that it could serve as a medium for sacred scripture, political propaganda, scientific diagrams, love letters, and commercial ledgers with equal ease. Yet its journey was far from over, for as the 18th century closed, new technologies were about to transform not only how paper was made, but the scale at which it could be produced, setting the stage for an explosion in literacy, communication, and mass media that would carry its legacy into the modern age. By the closing decades of the 18th century, the centuries-old art of papermaking, still rooted in labor-intensive handcraft, was about to be transformed by the same forces of innovation that were reshaping agriculture, textiles, and transport. For hundreds of years, paper had been made from linen and cotton rags, which required meticulous sorting, cleaning, and pulping, and production was limited by the speed and stamina of human hands. But the rapid expansion of literacy, newspapers, and printed books in the Age of Enlightenment was putting unprecedented strain on the supply. The Industrial Revolution brought both the problem and the solution. In 1799, a Frenchman named Louis-Nicolas Robert patented a machine capable of producing a continuous roll of paper. a design later refined in England by the Fourdrinier brothers, whose name became synonymous with modern papermaking. Instead of forming one sheet at a time in a mold, the Fourdrinier machine used an endless woven wire belt that received a steady flow of pulp, allowing water to drain, while a series of rollers pressed and dried the sheet. This meant that factories could produce miles of paper in the time it once took to make a few dozen sheets. But technology alone was not enough. Raw materials had to change too. As demand surged in the 19th century, the rag supply collapsed under the weight of mass consumption, leading innovators to search for alternatives. In the 1840s, processes for turning wood into pulp were perfected, first by mechanical grinding and later by chemical treatments that broke down lignin. Wood pulp was cheaper, more abundant, and easier to source. And though early papers made from it were more acidic and prone to yellowing, the sheer volume it allowed transformed paper from a relatively precious commodity into something nearly disposable. This revolution fueled a vast expansion in publishing. Newspapers could be sold for pennies, literacy campaigns could reach rural populations, and even the most modest households could afford writing paper. Across Europe and North America, great mills rose along rivers, not just for their water supply, but to harness steam power, their chimneys marking industrial skylines. These mills became the heart of entire towns, employing hundreds in jobs ranging from log cutting and pulping to machine operation and finishing. At the same time, the global trade in paper continued to expand, with colonial territories supplying both raw materials and markets. Japan adapted its washi traditions to produce fine art papers alongside industrial stock. India imported machine-made paper for administration while still producing handmade sheets for ceremonial and artistic purposes. Egypt, the symbolic cradle of writing, now imported reams of European paper for its schools and government offices. By the late 19th century, paper was so deeply woven into modern life that it underpinned not only literature and journalism, but also packaging, advertising, stock certificates, banknotes, and even early photographic prints. Yet with abundance came new challenges: environmental concerns over deforestation, the exploitation of labor in pulpwood regions, and the ephemeral nature of acidic papers that crumbled in archives within decades. In response, the 20th century saw improvements in pulp processing, the development of alkaline and acid-free papers for preservation, and the recycling of waste paper into new stock. The same Fourdrinier principles endured, but machines grew larger, faster, and more precise, capable of producing specialty papers for countless purposes. By the dawn of the digital age, it seemed that the very survival of paper might be in question, as screens replaced pages for news, correspondence, and record-keeping. Yet paper has persisted, not in spite of the digital revolution, but alongside it. Its tactile presence and reliability, ensuring that it remains essential for art, design, packaging, and even secure documentation. From the reed fields along the Nile to the bamboo groves of ancient China, from the dusty caravans crossing the Silk Road to the roaring mills of industrial Europe, paper's journey has been one of constant reinvention, shaped by the cultures that adopted it and the technologies that transformed it. Its history is not just a story of material and method, but of human ingenuity, communication, and the enduring desire to share knowledge, record memory, and leave a mark that time can carry forward. Even as the world hurtles deeper into the age of instant digital transmission, the simple sheet of paper, folded into a letter, bound into a book, or printed as a newspaper, remains a quiet testament to a 2,000-year voyage that began with a handful of plant fibers beaten into pulp and will likely continue in some form for centuries to come. Thank you for watching, wishing you a beautiful new day filled with good luck when you wake, and see you again on Sleep Whisper.